Hello, my name is Ana Soler, and I'll be sharing suggestions and best practices related to language access and equity in communication. I am the chairperson of the National Association of Educational Translators and Interpreters of Spoken Languages, or NATISO, and have been an interpreter, translator, and trainer for over 25 years. The goal of this session is for interpreters to understand the policies and procedures that guide schools to provide appropriate language access to emerging bilingual families, ways to move from language access to equity and communication, and the roles and responsibilities of interpreters in this journey. This presentation is designed to supplement the chapter that I wrote and that you will be reading as a course assignment titled Language Access and Equal Footing for Families, a Personal Perspective. Let's start by establishing that promoting more linguistically inclusive school settings for multilingual parent populations is a journey and not a destination. It is an ongoing process with many variables and components, and trained spoken language interpreters play an essential role as they support the collaboration between educators and emerging bilingual families. As we have learned from previous readings and videos shared during this training, there are federal guidelines that establish language access as an obligation. Some examples include Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which specifies that entities receiving federal funds must provide language access, and the Dear Colleague letter developed and distributed by the Department of Justice and the Department of Education. However, compliance with federal language access policies is the first of many steps and should be considered an important starting point for promoting effective communication between our families and school staff. Besides complying with federal laws regarding language access, research on family engagement in culturally and linguistically diverse families shows that language based communication barriers make it especially difficult for emerging bilingual families to fully participate in all aspects of their child's educational experience. So, trained spoken language interpreters provide access to information and services which help families to take an active stake in their child's education. This includes a parent's right to understand information and processes related to educational services offered by districts and their right to make decisions that are in the best interest of their child's education. Let's review what language access can look like in a school district. Massachusetts recommends that districts use a three-tier system to provide language access services to families. This pyramid with three different tier levels represents the combination of services that a school may provide depending on their population, their resources, and staff. Schools may train and use language ambassadors to provide basic language services during spontaneous encounters, such as phone calls related to transportation, school front office visitors, and school clinic inquiries. Tier 1 language ambassadors are bilingual personnel whose primary job is not to interpret and who have completed the language ambassador training video available on the DC website. When a language ambassador is not available or a bilingual individual has not completed the language ambassador training, an interpretation or translation app such as Google may be used to translate short messages for parents. This option should be used as a last resort, as family engagement is difficult to achieve when opportunities to build rapport with families are lost and nonverbal communication is not allowed. In addition, translation apps do not consider the complexity of language and the cultural layers and nuances that make for clear communication. Tier 2 interpreters have demonstrated language proficiency in English and in their working languages and provide professional interpretation during parent-teacher conferences and meetings without a legal context. Tier 3 interpreters support educators and families with advanced interpretation during special education meetings, disciplinary hearings, and other meetings that may include legal terminology. In-person interpreters are preferred as they help to build rapport with families. Virtual interpreters can be an alternative when a meeting must take place on short notice or when transportation or childcare issues may impede a family from participating, or when the family speaks a language not available at the school. So schools may collaborate with phone interpreters when needed to support educators and families with communication. But regardless of whether a Tier 2 or Tier 3 interpreter is available in person or via remote interpretation platforms or phone, they must have completed training specific to the education setting. Sometimes schools rely on bilingual school personnel to assist with interpretation. There can be an advantage to collaborating with bilingual staff members to provide language access since staff members are familiar with the school procedures and vocabulary. However, it is important that schools provide clear expectations for staff in terms of their dual roles and the appropriate situations that may require them to leave their main functions to assist with interpretation. In addition, bilingual staff would benefit from opportunities to confirm their language proficiency in the languages they will be interpreting, and also participate in the appropriate training that includes the specific ethics and skills needed to be accurate and impartial when interpreting in schools. The question we must ask is whether providing some type of language access is enough to ensure that emergent bilingual families benefit from equity in communication. So there's no doubt that language access policies, especially ones that seek to equitably accommodate linguistically diverse populations in public education, are essential for protecting the language rights of emergent bilingual families in public schools. However, promoting and protecting language rights requires more than a policy, as systems must make good on their promise of legal protections in their public institutions. This includes providing families with trained interpreters to ensure that communication is confidential, accurate, and impartial. So, how do we move from providing the federally required language access services to supporting emerging bilingual families to become active participants in their children's education? And how can trained and qualified interpreters help in this process? So, one way to get started in this journey is to reduce and eventually eliminate labels that emphasize language acquisition and language development as a deficit. Being able to speak more than one language should not be considered a barrier or a limitation, but rather a cultural and linguistic asset that highlights families as collaborators and contributors to their students' education. Next, as interpreters, we must understand our role and responsibility to provide accurate and complete communication and recognize our skill limitations. If a meeting involves terminology or protocols that we are not familiar with, we should know the steps to take in the school district to identify another interpreter that can support the educator and the family with complete communication. As interpreters supporting equity in communication, we must be fully aware of our code of ethics and standards of practice. However, I encourage you to also apply the concepts of the code of ethics to everyday situations that you encounter in a school setting, recognizing that the code of ethics serves as a guide and allows you the flexibility of applying your professional judgment to specific situations. We must advocate for the protection of confidentiality and impartiality in our own practice and that of our colleagues. We must refrain from participating in conversations that may share sensitive or personal information pertaining to an educator or a family outside of a meeting. We must understand that information related to abuse, whether it's child abuse or elder abuse, as well as information about direct threats of harm to the self or to others, constitute special cases under the principle of confidentiality. Many states, including Massachusetts, mandate the disclosure of information by designated persons such as educators and interpreters when the abuse of a person is at stake or when a person is threatening harm to him or herself or others. If you are a district employee, you should already be aware of your district's protocol for reporting suspected abuse or neglect. If you are a contract interpreter, you should inquire about the district's protocol and take immediate action should the occasion arise. If we feel that a conflict of interest is present, whether it is because we have known the family for a long time and will not be able to be neutral, or the topic of the meeting is sensitive of nature, we must voice those concerns and support the school in identifying another interpreter to assist or to take steps necessary to help you keep your impartiality in check. As interpreters, we must also take the time to ask questions and clarify terminology and concepts that may differ from the educational system of the family and that of the United States. Let's take a look at this chart related to scores on the Massachusetts Comprehensive Assessment System, or MCAS. The information is complex in English, and as interpreters, we must be willing to ask questions and accept that we won't know all of the abbreviations and all the terms that we will hear during a meeting. We are responsible for intervening to ensure that all the information is provided as clearly as possible. As supporters of clear and equal communication, we must be aware of terminology that may not exist in the educational system that the parent is familiar with, such as grade level expectations or coordinated academic assistance, and be aware of verbal and nonverbal cues that may indicate that the parent does not understand the information. As professional and trained interpreters, we must take the time to explain why an emergent bilingual family who communicates beautifully in English with a teacher when dropping off a student may still need an interpreter during a parent-teacher conference, as the parent's social and academic language skills may differ. As we have learned, educational jargon and terminology are difficult to understand even for English speakers, and as we process an additional language, these terms and concepts may require more explanation from the part of the educator and more skills on the part of the interpreter to transfer the information accurately. Many parents may also feel that they understand more English than they can speak and may prefer to communicate through an interpreter. In fact, some families may want to have an interpreter present just in case a word or a concept is misunderstood, but are motivated to use their emergent English skills to ask questions and participate in the process. So, as interpreters, we must take these opportunities to empower families and be supportive of this effort. We must feel comfortable stepping back when asked to do so by school personnel or the family. We must also step in if we notice any misunderstanding or any cultural concept that impedes communication. Our collaboration with educators and their understanding of our roles can be highlighted during honest conversations about what an interpreter can or cannot do. We must share with educators suggestions on how to collaborate with interpreters, the reasons why we must ask for pauses during meetings to ensure that we have captured the message to interpret it accurately, and how beneficial it would be for everyone involved if abbreviations, acronyms, and educational jargon are kept to a minimum to support equity and communication. It is also important that we share what we know about language acquisition and any other cultural factors that we as interpreters may feel that educators must be aware of to support communication. So, explaining to educators why meetings with interpreters will take longer helps with the time management process and avoids rushed exchanges of information that may leave parents and educators frustrated and confused. Emergent bilingual families may need extra time to formulate questions due to the differences between the U.S. educational system and that of back home. As professionals, we can also promote equity and communication by participating in professional development opportunities to expand our terminology and skills in specific areas. As part of the educational team, interpreters would benefit from participating in continuing education sessions that expose them to the school vocabulary and culture. Lastly, we should collaborate with educators to provide families with opportunities to offer feedback about our services. This information can help us grow as interpreters and determine whether we need to adjust our practice to promote accuracy and also the skill sets that we need to expand in order to do so. Besides providing language access to families and educators, you as an interpreter can contribute to supporting your schools as they move toward equity of communication. Although school districts should have a policy to identify bilingual families and should not rely on interpreters to do so, you can provide insight about ways to improve such policies and ways to meet specific language needs during school functions based on your cultural or contextual knowledge. Both contract interpreters and school-based interpreters can help orient school staff on appropriate ways to collaborate with an interpreter on the different modes of interpreting, including consecutive and simultaneous interpreting, and the relationship between clear communication and family engagement. Some of the best practices that school districts have implemented to reach equity and communication include the early identification of emergent bilingual families, which may include a school-based language support needs assessment, a centralized interpretation and translation unit focusing on addressing and assigning interpreters with the proper training and qualifications for specific types of meetings is often needed for medium to large school districts or those with a large number of families who speak a language other than English. Other best practices include ongoing training for staff on language access requirements and school-based or external resources to provide support, along with ongoing training for school-based and independent interpreters working with the school, data collection related to language access services, and gathering feedback from families, educators, and interpreters about language access services. All these strategies have the objective of establishing the highest standards of communication with emerging bilingual families and determining service gaps that may exist and which need to be addressed to reach equity in communication. Equity in communication, as we mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, is a journey and not a destination. All the families and educators in our schools deserve to receive accurate, complete, and impartial communication without allowing language to be an obstacle in this interaction. As school-based or independent interpreters, we have a responsibility to clarify our roles, embrace ongoing training, and to find avenues and tools to communicate the influence that communication has on family engagement. Given the increasingly diverse composition of public school environments, multilingual communication should no longer be viewed as a form of extra support that is only accessed when needed. It is best practice for language access policies to be centered on inclusive schooling practices and promoted as an essential component to support all families to access the full benefits of the U.S. public education system. I would like to conclude this presentation with an overview of some of the terms related to language access that you may hear and use in your practice. Emergent bilingual families describes families who are at the beginning of the bilingual journey or bilingual continuum. And this term reflects an asset-based perspective as opposed to the deficit framing reflected by a term such as limited English proficient. Language access means the rights of the parents and guardians of students and the responsibilities of state and local education agencies as well as individual schools that have been established by federal laws and policy guidance. When we talk about nationally certified, we're talking about a national certification process that is designed to collect standards-based evidence on accomplished practice. In the world of interpreters, there's a national certification process for legal, medical, and sign language interpreters, but not yet for educational interpreters. The National Association of Educational Translators and Interpreters of Spoken Languages is currently working on a pilot test to certify interpreters nationally. Spoken language interpreters are interpreters who relay information from one language to another in a consecutive or simultaneous form. And the word spoken is added to differentiate between sign language interpreters and those who use verbal language to communicate. And lastly, translators. They relay information from one language to another, and they do so in a written format through documents, brochures, website, and other formats. Thank you so much for your attention to this information, and I wish you the best in your journey towards supporting equity and communication.